All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel. We try to focus in on great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, grand unified theories, magnum opuses, tour de forces, and earth-shattering discoveries from obscure sources. Things that you probably haven't heard of before, but if you did, they would help you with your own life, your awakening to 5D consciousness, your formation of a holistic worldview, your quest for better spiritual, mental, and physical health, including your own personal sovereignty and freedom. And today is our 183rd day on the Reciprocal Church unit, where we are putting together the resources to kind of put together a new religion in the wake of the old religions, which are about to collapse as we begin to red pill ourselves to the truth of the matter and mature a little bit, and kind of move ourselves out of this kind of juvenile, anthropomorphic and even psychopathic, sociopathic versions of God that we have out there. That God gets mad at you and damns you to eternal fire, and that God is jealous and zealous and obsessive compulsive and addicted to smoking meat and all kinds of very arbitrary in leveling out justice, and like some people more than others, some races of people more than others, and it's just something that most people can't stomach it. I think a lot of people go along with it and just don't go too deep into it. But given that so many people are red pilling themselves finally in the last 10 years, eventually they're going to get around to backing up the calendar, backing up the calendar to further than the Kennedy assassination, further than the formation of the Illuminati, and all the way back to Adam and Eve. And then we're going to see the implosion, at least as far back as the Caesars. And it will be pretty obvious to people who do the deep dive that the Caesars are the ones who wrote the New Testament, and the Old Testament was plagiarized from much older sources that describe a pretty, grotesque creation that we seem to have been the not so beneficiaries of, but that there have been a few intercessions on our behalf that have given us a great amount of potential, and to the point that the people who created us even are jealous of us at this point. But we'll get to that. But what we're doing, and then so in light of all that, and we have to pragmatically put together stuff that we can believe in. And so we've been doing a lot of that on this channel. We looked at some creative ecstatic music, understanding the maps of meditation, using the tree of life as a map, using sacred geometry and quantum arithmetic. We'll be getting into a lot of that coming up. And there are going to be several more. But in addition to that, we're right now we're kind of going through getting ready to decode the New Testament to provide the once and for all proof of what I'm saying and what many other scholars are starting to say, that the Caesars wrote the Gospels, the Caesars most likely wrote Acts, different Caesars, but probably from the same dynasty, the Flavian dynasty from 69 to 96 AD, which included Vespasian, the father, who was the first general in the war against the Jews, and Titus, the second general, his son, who was Caesar from 79 to 81 AD, and then his brother Domitian from 81 to 96 AD, with the help of a character named Josephus, who was really the adopted brother of Titus and Domitian, and who was a historian who wrote the War of the Jews. But he was also a Jew who was one of the generals or commanders of the Jewish army in the War of the Jews, but then surrendered to Vespasian when he saw that the whole thing was hopeless, which he thought all along, and at some point decided that in his mind that God had now decided to favor the Romans instead of the Jews, and so he defected to the Romans, and he plays a very key part in this typological puzzle that is the Gospels and his book, The War of the Jews, which go on parallel lines. And if you decode the puzzles, you discover that anybody who believes in the Gospels, believes in the worship of Jesus, is actually worshiping the Caesars. And there are many other ways that you're being mocked by the Romans if you are, worshiping Jesus. And they lay it right down. They sign their names to it. And they, it's a little bit difficult to discover. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. And so eventually people are going to be doing the deep dive on that. So we're trying to get ahead of the game here a little bit. And we've also been looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls, especially since they provide the fill of the vacuum that is left behind in the first century. If Josephus is a Roman agent, a Roman family member, and the Gospels were written along with Josephus, whoever Josephus is, whether he really existed or if he's just a projection of the Caesars, somebody knew a lot about Jewish history and Jewish theology, who was writing the Gospels and who was also writing War of the Jews and Antiquities of the Jews by Josephus. So whoever that was probably a Hellenized Jew, a Romanized Jew. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, if those two books, they used to supply pretty much all of what we knew about the first century in history, between the Gospels and the War of the Jews and the Antiquities of the Jews. But if those aren't valid, then we have nothing. But then in the mid-20th century, in a bunch of caves outside of Jerusalem, were discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. Hundreds of books, including every one of the Old Testament books, except for Esther, and a ton of the other Old Testament Apocrypha, like the Book of Jubilees. We're talking about the Hebrew text of Ecclesiasticus today, and also Book of Jubilees, Book of Enoch. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are like 10 copies of the Book of Jubilees, 30 copies of the Psalms, Book of Psalms, 20 copies of the Book of Genesis, and so on. But then there's also a lot of sectarian material, which is specific to this sect of people that were living there at Qumran, which is the place where the caves were. But the problem is that nobody has really acknowledged, very few people have acknowledged the importance of the Dead Sea Scrolls findings, because they were assigned to the international team of scholars who were supposed to, translate and put these out to the public. This is kind of like seems like a very globalist kind of thing. Just appoint a group of so-called scholars who happen to almost all be Roman Catholic priests, and tell them to, do their civic duty and translate these things. Unfortunately, they saw something they didn't like, and so they basically sat on these documents for 35 years and nobody really saw them. Eventually, Robert Eisenman and others put up a big stink and threatened to sue them, and even use other legal tactics against them, and got photographs of all the documents. But it took like 45 years in total. It was not until the early 90s that they were out there. But since then, Eisenman really claims that the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls are, he says in one of his introduction to this particular book that we're looking at right now, I believe, or it might be one of his other books, he says they change everything. And from what I've seen of the Dead Sea Scrolls, I look forward to getting farther into them as time goes on. They do change a lot, because they use, even though these are Jews, and probably starting in the 2nd century, 1st century, and the 1st century AD, 2nd century BC, and through the 1st century AD, they use much of the same language, or even jargon, private language, phrases, idioms, expressions, titles, rituals, rites, dietary practices, calendar, daily life, as what's talked about in the Gospels. And so these people are definitely connected in that way. And Eisenman, here in this book that we're looking at today, called Maccabees, Zadokites, Christians, and Qumran, goes into what we can learn from these documents. I've also been checking out one of his other books that's called the New Testament Code, which I would prefer to go over, but the book is like 1,000 pages long. So I've been trying to find highlights of it, but he basically comes up with, through a thorough reading of like all of these Dead Sea Scrolls stuff, a lot of the Christian Apocrypha, other sources like the Clementines, which I think is, I think that's a later source, but I'm not sure exactly what the Clementine source is. And there's the pseudo Clementines also, and determines that Paul was a Herod. Paul was from the Herod family. When they refer to Herod the Tetrarch and his foster brother is Paul. So I'm not saying that that's right for sure, but I'm just saying that that's an interesting thing to look at. But he's come up with it through a reading of all of these relevant books, and that's what I find really interesting about Eisenman's work, is he goes over these details of like who is who, which person are we talking about, and I think the term he uses, it's not revolving door, but it's just like who is behind door number 3 or whatever. It's like they identify certain people, but they maybe identify them slightly differently depending on whether you're looking at the book of Acts or in the book of Romans or something, or somewhere in the epistles. And these people, the same people, are referred to in some of these apocryphal books. And you really have to stack them all up and go over them really like painstakingly to make some of these conclusions. And so Eisenman has like thousands of pages of that stuff. I think they will benefit us to are doing our decode of starting with the book of Luke, but also definitely Revelation, and probably some of the epistles as well. And then eventually, we'll see what happens. We'll get into the Old Testament eventually, but that's a totally different kind of decode. Okay, we're going to read starting from chapter 3, Ecclesiasticus and Priestly Legitimacy by Robert Eisenman from his book Maccabees, Zadokites, Christians in Qumran. You maybe remember that the Maccabees were like the Jewish dynasty from the 2nd century who overtook the Seleucids, the Greeks who had colonized Palestine since the days of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC, late 4th century. And then the Zadokites, that's the priestly class of Jews, going all the way back to Zadok from David fame, King David fame. And Qumran, again, is the place where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. And he uses that term just to refer to the sect of people. Sometimes he calls them the sectarians also. So Ecclesiasticus is this, well, he says the all-important Hebrew text of Ecclesiasticus, found at 3 locations over the last century. The Cairo Geniza, which I believe is where the Damascus document was discovered, which was discovered like 50 years before the Dead Sea Scrolls, but then it was also found in the Dead Sea Scrolls when they were discovered. So this was found there too, in Cairo, at Qumran, and at Masada. And Masada is the fortress that was the last bastion holdout from the War of the Jews. They held out all the way until 73 AD, even though the temple at Jerusalem fell in 70 AD. And at Masada, they all apparently, according to Josephus, they made a suicide pact and they all killed themselves as opposed to surrendering to the Romans eventually. So this Ecclesiasticus book was found at all 3 of these places, is crucial to the matter of the Zadokite Sadducean priestly claims, and one of the keys to unraveling the Second Temple sectarian puzzle. The Sadducean or scribal character of the text has generally been recognized of Ecclesiasticus. What was not so plain was its sectarian character, meaning thinking Qumran, nor how the all-important material in chapters 50 and 51 missing from the Septuagint Vulgate version. And so the Septuagint was the Greek Hebrew Bible, and the Vulgate is the Latin Bible. So apparently this is missing from those versions, which kind of surprises me that it's even in those versions. But going on, I didn't get the explanation of that. Apparently this wasn't as apocryphal at the time. Missing from the Septuagint, because the Septuagint is from like 3rd century BC. It's from the Ptolemaic rule in Egypt / Greece. Ptolemy was one of the generals under Alexander, but the Vulgate was much later Latin version, and I think that also included the New Testament. Okay, so was used to legitimize priestly claims by all the sects heir to the legacy, spiritual or otherwise, of the saintly Simeon the Zadok. These include, as we shall see, the Maccabees, Zealots, Zadokites, and probably even the Christians. Therefore, all the groups outside of the Pharisaic Herodian establishment of 40 BC onwards. The Pharisees also used Simeon, but not to establish priestly legitimacy, rather as a link in the transmission of right-guided tradition. I have left both Essenes and Sadducees off the list. it is strictly speaking imprecise to refer to the Zadokites at Qumran as Essenes, which the majority of scholars in the field tend to do for polemical reasons of their own. The sectaries at Qumran might be Essenes, but the case is by no means proven, nor is it clear how the Essenes saw the problem of the priestly succession, nor how they would then differ from Hasidians, zealots, partisans of Judas Maccabee, or even his enemies. One is on safer ground to use the sectary's own terminology, whether sons of Zadok, Ebionim, Zadokim, Hasidim, or some other, all terms found generously sprinkled throughout their literature and meaningful in the light of sectarian history in Palestine. For their part, the so-called Sadducees are dominated by the Pharisees in their post-Herodian embodiment, as Josephus tells us in no uncertain terms. They are in no way Zadokite, if Qumran is typical of what we mean by Zadokite. Now he's referring to the Sadducees. They are no way Zadokite. We have already noted that their legal and spiritual legitimacy was called into question by those Josephus calls desirous of innovation, as early as 4 BC. Now, I think that's the date of the Judas uprising, Judas Maccabeus, or Judas the Galilean, and I've seen that as 6 BC also. But since our understanding of this time period is so sketchy, that could be the same, because I think they dated it based on Herod the Great's rule, which I believe ended in 4 BC. And I think he had like in the Bible, it says that Herod, decided to kill all the children under 2 or whatever. And, they used that as a marker for dating the birth of Jesus. But, the Bible usually just uses the term Herod. There's like 20 of them. The Herods are just a whole dynasty, and they make up the king and the tetrarch and the different the procurator. They make up all of the different political offices in Palestine at this time. A lot of them are Herods, and the Herods are pretty into incest also. So they're always marrying their brothers or sisters and stuff. So it gets really complicated. And I think the Bible just, the New Testament usually just uses the term Herod. Anyway, Josephus calls them desirous of innovation as early as 4 BC, quite properly, as it were, since these new model Sadducees are thoroughly compromised by their Roman Herodian connections. Now, so the Herods were like a puppet government that the Romans set up there in Palestine. And the Herodians were pretty much, I believe, Idumeans, which is an Arab tribe that also has some Greek background. And I think they so-called converted to Judaism to get this gig here in Palestine, but they're not really too strict about it. Let us attempt a reconstruction following priestly lines of legitimacy, but without adhering to the interpretation of Zadokite as implying only or even primarily genealogical descent. It is generally accepted that Simeon the Zadok is a true son of Zadok, therefore a lineal descendant of the Davidic, Solomonic, high priest. But there is nowhere any proof of this. This is one of the implicit assumptions of Qumran scholarship, and it should be found wanting. Most of the edifice so artfully constructed upon it becomes extremely fragile. And so he's saying that, not only in this case of Simeon, but in other cases, the Bible or some other one of these Hebrew texts just says that he is of Davidic, Solomonic descent, but there's no proof of that. There is no proof that Ezra is a Zadokite priest, or Ezekiel, who first employs the term in a significant way, or even Elijah for that matter. It is true that someone wants us to think that Ezra is a Zadokite priest, and he is supplied with a good Zadokite genealogy. But on closer inspection, one finds he is given the exact same genealogy as Jesus ben Jehozadak 100 years earlier, the first high priest after the return from captivity. Even this genealogy has gaps in it and contradicts what is known about priestly succession in other parts of the Bible. For Bowman, all such genealogies are artificial, since very little survived the Babylonian destruction. Biblical ploys, old or new, on matters of genealogy are, in any event, something to be handled with circumspection. Yeah, I think the genealogies given of Jesus in the two Gospels that they're in, I can't remember which ones, but they are also contradicting. More importantly, what has never been remarked is that the claim being put forward on behalf of Ezra is not the normal Zadokite one at all, but rather what we have been calling the zealot. Indeed, Ezra is the zealous priest par excellence, showing incontrovertible zeal for the law, even to the extent of demanding the divorce of alien, including Samaritan, wives, a typical Phineas-style procedure. And Phineas was I can't remember the story, but he was the kind of originator of the zealous, and really maybe you would call it xenophobic approach, to Hebrewism. No doubt Ezra would have preferred a harsher penalty than excommunication had the Yehud of his day not simply been autonomous, and had he had the powers to impose the death penalty. I think the Yehud is like the court, although I thought that was the Sanhedrin, so maybe this is like the more secular political court. I would imagine that wouldn't exist. So I don't know what the Yehud is. I will try to look that up. In any case, his powers seem to have reached right into the Zadokite high priestly household itself. Not only does he occupy its temple chambers, but he banishes some of his heirs, Sanballat's son-in-law, which seems to be the birth moment of Samaritan Zadokite claims. If we are unable to prove the legitimate Zadokite descent of any priestly hero of the Bible after the Solomonic period, imagine the embarrassment of the priests of Judas's day, Judas the Galilean, who certainly could not do so either. Of the 24 courses of the temple, only 16 could even be Zadokite. And which ones of these might be is impossible to determine. Though Chronicles attempts a retrospective portrait of these, the names it includes are identifiably Second Temple, One of these is accused in Ezra's time of not even being of priestly descent. In any event, the Maccabees put forth in the safest manner possible their Zadokite claim in 1 Maccabees by signaling their membership in the first and largely priestly course, that of Jehoiarib. It is as good a claim as any, especially when reinforced by the portrait of Mattathias's Phineas-like behavior. Where did the assumption come from that the Maccabees could not be considered Zadokite, or even that they were not priestly, appertaining rather to some lower Levitical order? There is nothing but a confused distortion of historical data to suit desired theoretical claims. We do not even know to what course Simeon's family belonged, unless it be that of Jedediah. And it is not at all outside the realm of possibility that the Maccabees constituted a lesser branch of his family, as the Tobiads had in a previous generation. To claim Zadokite descent in Jesus' time would be like being able to claim descent from Dante in our own. Ecclesiasticus, especially chapter 51, was so important because it delineated an instrumentality for claiming priestly legitimacy, the days when all priestly genealogies had difficulty in going back to Ezra's time. First, Simeon is the high priest, but he is so on Zadokite lines. Therefore, he is a Zadok, a pious man. Hasid and Zadok are in some sense parallel usages, probably going back to Isaiah, and have continued as such in scroll literature, Karaism, and Jewish mysticism up to the present day. In this manner, the crucial list of the Anshai Hesed in the Hebrew Ecclesiasticus begins and ends with Zadokim, Noah, and Simeon. I think we must grant that Simeon the Just is Aaronite, according to the normal usage of that term. In Second Temple period times, the priests, or sons of Aaron, seem more of a caste, as they were in Zoroastrianism, or as the Brahmins in India, than a specific genealogy. Okay, I'm going to stop there. He's got some really long paragraphs here. And we will take over here tomorrow and get further into this. Thanks for tuning in today.